Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Audit, Risk and Governance Committee meeting held in the Council Chamber Civic Centre, 6 Patterson Street, Mundijong, on Monday, the 24th of February 2025. As a presiding member, I'll declare the meeting open at 6:14 p.m. and welcome the committee members and staff, and I do apologise for the slight delay in getting started. I'd like to acknowledge the Noongar people of the Budja, the land that we gather on today. For thousands of years, their connection to country has provided knowledge, guidance, spirituality and life. We pay our respects to this ongoing connection, as well as to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to advise that the meeting is being live streamed and audio recorded. No other visual or audio recording of this meeting by any other means is allowed. This brings us to agenda item 1, which is attendances and apologies. I have received an apology from Councillor Bishop, and we also have a leave of absence from Councillor Morgan Bias. I'd like to welcome my fellow elected members and our external members, Mrs. Newby and Mr. Corelli, and our officers, CEO Mr. Martin, Mr. Scadoni, Mr. Oliver, Claire Mortimer, who is filling in today as Acting Director of Corporate Services, Mr. Trosick, and the Executive Manager of Operations, Mr. Jamodian. Mr. Jamodian is an apology today as well. And we also have our PA to the Director, Miss Bavaro. Agenda item number 2 is for public questions, which there are nil. Agenda item 3 is deputations, which there are nil. Agenda item 4 is declaration of committee members and officers' interests, which I have not received any, Mr. CEO.
I haven't received any.
There is nil. Agenda item 5 is the receipt of minutes or reports and consideration of adoption of recommendations from committee meetings held since the previous council meeting. 5.1 is the minutes of previous Audit, Risk and Governance Committee meetings. 5.1.1 is the Audit, Risk and Governance Committee meeting from the 25th of November 2024. Would anybody like to move those minutes? Ms. Newby. And anyone to second? Councillor Jarrett. Is anybody opposed? That is carried unanimously. Takes us to agenda item 5.1.2, which is the Special Audit, Risk and Governance Committee meeting held on the 28th of January 2025. Audit, Risk and Governance, do I have a mover for those minutes? Councillor Jarrett. And a seconder, Ms. Newby. Thanking you. Is anybody opposed? They are carried unanimously. This brings us to agenda item 6, which is reports for consideration. 6.1 is the Shire of Serpentine Jarrahdale Bushfire Service Brigade Operating Procedures Review. Do I have any questions? Oh, Mr. Corelli.
Sorry, Ms. Newby, just beat you to that one. I note that there is quite a low level of compliance in that report. Has there been an update to the numbers? Because I have some concerns that we may be leaving ourselves a bit short-handed if we're removing all of these volunteers if we're at low compliance.
Director of Community Engagement.
Thank you for the question, and I've just received a text message from our Coordinator of Emergency Services. I was suspecting this question might have come. He's advised that as of Friday there were approximately 10 members from each brigade not in compliance, so there has been an increase in compliance since this report was published. As was noted in the report, we have received compliance from the most active members of each brigade. As detailed in the report, we'll continue to work with brigade captains regarding outstanding compliance from respective members. But to answer the question, we're not concerned with how we're tracking, as well as with the compliance we've received to date regarding the membership.
Thank you.
And Ms. Newby.
I was just seeking confirmation that that final information session on the 20th of February did occur, because that may be one of the reasons that they've been a bit slow to return their forms. Near the bottom of page 5.
Yes, that did occur.
Any further questions? President Coles?
Thank you. I've got a question, and I don't know whether it's appropriate for this. One concern that I've had is in relation to the business operating procedures. There was some talk at one point about members of council, members of staff being precluded from being on or as a member of the volunteer brigades. Has that been looked at? And if so, what's the end result? And if not, why not? Thank you.
Director of Community Engagement.
That has a review of the brigade operating procedure relating to that matter has not occurred. If I can just get clarification on the question, is it relating to just employees or elected members and employees?
What I'm trying to ascertain is, my understanding was with these new business operating procedures, volunteers, directly or indirectly, are considered to be employees of the Shire. If my understanding of this is correct, then how does that work with a member who is a councillor being a volunteer on a bushfire brigade, where to all intents and purposes they are an employee of the Shire?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so you're right. The changes to the workplace health and safety legislation does essentially make all the volunteers essentially employees in terms of how they are treated by the Shire, which is the need for the Code of Conduct and the revised business operating procedures. The matter of elected members being members of brigades is not something that has been addressed in the current brigade business operating procedure. It is something that's on the radar for consideration at that time as part of the next review, and there'll be a series of ongoing reviews that occur over the coming years to get that to this point. If there was something the committee wanted to see now, that would be a good thing to get some direction from the Audit Committee on. But it's certainly on the identified list of things to do as far as the future reviews of either this or the local law, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. C. I guess for me, I think it is a risk, but I'm happy to hear what other members of the committee think. Thank you.
Before I take any more questions, did anyone else have any comments to that point?
I agree it is a risk, and perhaps we should put it... The only way we've got at the moment to follow up on risks is via the risk register, and it may be something we need to put there as an action, that we need to clarify the situation regarding that employment. Because I agree, it's on the face of it, sounds like a conflict of interest, but it may be that they might have a carve out for that in the legislation, I'm not sure. But effectively, you'd be covered by, if whoever's a volunteer is covered by the bushfire regulation insurance, so that's why it would be a conflict of interest, because it's effectively a workers' comp cover. I agree. So my suggestion is we put that on the risk register. I don't know whether we need to word that within whatever option we're going for, 1 or 2, to add that.
Or if I could be so bold as to make an alternative suggestion, the committee could add a point 5 that they asked to bring a report back on the pros and cons of elected members being members of bushfire brigades, if that was something that was desired.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. CEO. I don't know if pros and cons is the right term. I know you're just trying to help, but It's just whether it is a risk, I guess, is what I'm trying to work out. It may well be that the committee decides it's not a risk, but we don't know unless we have that looked at. So I don't know if Ms Newby...
Well, I think we need a legal clarification. I think that's where it is. And because of that, I tend to put it as an action because we're actually seeking to do something. So if we put it under, it's number 6 on the risk register, which is the fire brigade one, I believe, bushfire management. Perhaps we put it as an action there.
So that, I guess, can be put forward as a part of a motion. Was there any other questions anyone had? Ms Neeby?
Yes, just one other thing I was just going to put, whether it had been considered as a risk, whether we haven't sufficient volunteers, because if people are unable to be or don't want to fill out forms, and we all know what happens with that, having just been through it with another organisation, is it a risk that we don't get enough volunteers because of the arduous part of joining up, which is obviously going to be a fact of life? And that was all because our bushfire management is really dependent on it being staffed. And if we can't get enough volunteers, whether or not they fill out forms or not, I think it's a risk.
Director of Community Engagement, would you like to respond?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Volunteer bushfire brigades are obviously no different to any other volunteer organisation, facing a constant challenge to attract and retain members. Our emergency services department and our community development team provides ongoing support to assist the brigades in attracting volunteers. One of those is our annual community safety event that's held in October in advance of bushfire season. So that's an opportunity for us to obviously inform and educate the community about emergency preparedness, but obviously to hope or to try and attract new members. This year, as part of a citizenship ceremony, it was Wow Day, which is Wear Orange Wednesday, to promote the SES, and the feedback from the captain of the SES that was quite a productive event in attracting new volunteers. So while I do acknowledge your feedback around ensuring that we're not putting too much bureaucracy in the way of attracting and retaining volunteers, as detailed in the report, it's important that we ensure our compliance regarding work health and safety to ensure that volunteers understand their roles and responsibilities of being a volunteer of our volunteer bushfire brigades, not just to obviously protect them, but to protect our community. So comfortable with the approach that's outlined in the report.
Mr CEO?
And just to add to the Director's comments, I guess some of the feedback we've received from members of the brigades in the past is that we haven't dealt with conflict and all sorts of issues in the brigades well, and that's because there hasn't been necessarily the code of conduct to hold members to account for their behaviour, and the adopted brigade operating procedure to really clearly define what everyone's role is. So some of the informal feedback we've received, in fact, is that members are looking forward to this because it will mean the brigades, operate better, perhaps, moving forward, or at least compliant with current legislation anyway.
Any further questions?
I was just on the recruitment. I wonder whether it's been considered as one of the controls that we have is the recruitment drive, because our objective is to do bushfire, to do the bushfire management. It's whether we should have that as a control, because in all the controls that we've got there, none of them talk about staffing. They talk about internal staffing, but not volunteer staffing, and maybe we should have that as one of the controls.
Director, did you want to add to that?
Happy to review that administratively as part of the next review in advance of the next Audit, Risk and Governance Committee meeting, but if the committee would like to see that appear in a more timely fashion, then that could be considered as an amendment to the recommendation.
Any further questions? There being no further questions, would anybody like to put forward a motion? Both looking at each other.
Are we adding something to option 1 about seeking advice on the state of volunteers? We need to add that as number 5. We just need some wording for that.
Are you asking that the advice be the form of a future report to the Audit Committee? So maybe it's request the CEO provide a report to the future meeting of the Audit, Risk and Governance Committee, providing clarification on
The status of elected members serving as volunteers for the Shire, because it won't even be the bushfire, it'll probably be for everything. But bushfire is what we're talking about here, but we certainly do need to know for this.
I'm just thinking whether we need to include that to normal members of the staff, sorry, through the chair, members of the staff as well, but I wouldn't have thought there'd be any members of the staff, Mr CEO, that are volunteers in our local brigades, but...
It might be, Mr. President. Yep, it might be.
So maybe we put it together?
Sorry, if you're an employee of the Shire, you're already an employee. So this would just be another employee. So I don't think that, I know that's an issue, it might be an issue under code of conduct and stuff, but I don't think it's an issue for whether the...
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
So the Minute Secretary's got some draft wording there. Request the CEO provide a report to a future Audit, Risk and Governance Committee. Can we just change those words around? Report to a future on, and I'll throw to you, Ms Newby, for the wording of your...
It's on the status of elected members serving as volunteers on the bushfire, as bushfire volunteers. It's their legal status because, yes, and in particular, possible conflict if they are deemed to be employees. Of yes, elected members serving as bushfire volunteers, and we can just say full stop, in particular, whether they are, in particular, whether there is a conflict of interest in there being an elected member and effectively deemed to be an employee. I think we know what it means. It's not probably well worded, but yeah.
I think Ms Newby didn't...
In particular, whether there's a conflict of interest associated with their effectively being deemed an employee. I could word that a bit better. Can I word it a bit better? In particular, whether a conflict of interest will arise through an elected member being effectively treated as an employee under the... Yeah.
Can I just ask that you repeat the last sentence again, Ms Newby?
Okay. Well, in particular where there's... yeah, I'm just trying to make it clear because it seems clear to us, but I don't think it would be... It's not really worded clearly. What we're trying to find out is that if there's a conflict of interest associated with being an elected member and a deemed employee as a volunteer.
Can I make a suggestion? You could just actually, we've got the word volunteers and a full stop. You could make that a comma and say,
Yes.
in particular, where there's a conflict of interest, full stop. And that might address that whole thing.
Yes.
Because it's got the...
Yeah, that's fine.
Happy with that?
Yep, fine.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Ms Nibby, yes, just confirming we are happy with that. Do I have a second for the motion? Mr Crowley? Is anybody opposed? Motion is carried unanimously.
We will need a reason for the difference from the officer report, Ms Newby, so are you happy to provide a sentence to cover that?
It's added because we have a concern that elected members serving as volunteers may be deemed to be employees, and we need clarification on their status. That's the reason for that. Mm.
You happy with that?
Yes.
Thank you, Ms Newby. We can then move on to agenda item 6.2, which is compliance audit return. Do I have any questions with regards to this agenda item? There being no questions, would anybody like to move the officer's recommendation or an alternate motion? Mr Crowley, the officer's recommendation. Do I have a seconder? President Coles. Is anybody opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. This brings us to agenda item 6.3, the Strategic Risk Register Quarterly Review Report. And before I open to any questions, I am just going to throw to the Acting Director of Corporate Services just to discuss point 3, with the review of the Strategic Risk Register that is underway and the upcoming workshops.
Thanks very much. Through you, Presiding Member, there is an update provided on page 21 of the agenda on the process underway, but I'm happy to speak to that in a little more detail. So we have commenced review of our Strategic Risk Register. We have appointed an external consultant to help us facilitate that process. We have held a kick-off meeting with the CEO, Director of Corporate Services and the Chair of the Audit, Risk and Governance Committee with the consultant as well, just to go over the process and how it's all going to work. Essentially what we're going to do is a series of internal workshops with the executive, sort of not pushing the register aside, but kind of starting with an open mind and discussing the Shire's main strategic risks, particularly focusing on the delivery of the council plan. And then what we plan to do probably in early May is hold a workshop/presentation with the Audit Committee to present the findings of that process. It's also worth mentioning that should we find any risk on that register that perhaps are more operational than strategic, we will be incorporating that into our operational risk across the Shire. So it's the presiding member wanted me to mention today that we won't be losing that information that we already have as well, but we may find that if we're focusing back on our strategic risks with that lens, that we may actually reduce some of the detail and number of risks on that register.
Thank you for that. Was there any other questions with regards to this agenda item? Mr Crowley.
Yes, I note Risk 17, the ICT internal controls, has had its target date shifted by 12 months. I don't know if we've discussed this before, but was there some reasons behind that? Because I know there were some quite pressing ICT, particularly cybersecurity concerns that were going to be addressed with the controls.
Acting Director, Corporate Services.
I'm not across all the detail. I do know that the date's just been aligned to that report that went to the committee recently, and so the commitment is to undertake the resolution and the report findings from that report. Yeah.
Any further questions? There being no further questions, would anybody like to move either the officer's recommendation or an alternate? Councillor Duggan, are you happy to?
Happy to move officer's recommendation.
Officer's recommendation. Do I have a seconder? Ms Newby. Is anybody opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. This brings us to agenda item number 7, which is motions of which notice has been given, which there is nil. Agenda item 8 is urgent business, which there is nil. And agenda item 9 is closure of the meeting. I can call the meeting closed at 6:39 p.m. Thank you all for your attendance this evening.